I want to begin the lesson with an illustration, a video illustration. We're still going to talk about what would Jesus teach. But this little clip will introduce the thought so well.
Yertle the Turtle by Dr. Seuss. On the faraway island of Salamasond, Yertle the Turtle was king of the pond. A nice little pond. It was clean, it was neat, the water was warm, there was plenty to eat. The turtles had everything turtles might need, and they were all happy, quite happy indeed. They were until Yertle, the king of them all, decided the kingdom he ruled was too small. "I'm ruler," said Yertle, "of all that I see, but I don't see enough. That's the trouble with me. With this stone for a throne, I look down on my pond, but I cannot look down on the places beyond. This throne that I sit on is too low down. It ought to be higher," he said with a frown. "If I could sit high, how much greater I'd be. What a king! I'd be ruler of all that I see." So Yertle the Turtle King lifted his hand, and Yertle the Turtle King gave a command. He ordered 9 turtles to swim to his stone, and using these turtles he built a new throne. He made each turtle stand on another one's back, and he piled them all up in a 9-turtle stack. And then Yertle climbed up. He sat down on the pile. What a wonderful view! He could see most a mile. "All mine!" Yertle cried. "Oh, the things I now rule! I'm king of a cow, and I'm king of a mule. I'm king of a house, and what's more beyond that, I'm king of a blueberry bush and a cat. I'm Yertle the Turtle, oh marvelous me, for I am the ruler of all that I see." And all through that morning he sat there up high, saying over and over, "A great king am I," until long about noon. Then he heard a faint sigh. "What's that?" snapped the king, and he looked down the stack, and he saw at the bottom a turtle named Mac, just a part of his throne, and this plain little turtle looked up and he said, "Beg your pardon, King Yertle? I've pains in my back and my shoulders and knees. How long must we stand here, your majesty, please?" "Silence!" the king of the turtles barked back. "I'm king, and you're only a turtle named Mac. You stay in your place while I sit here and rule. I'm king of a cow, and I'm king of a mule. I'm king of a house, and a bush, and a cat. But that isn't all. I'll do better than that. My throne shall be higher," his royal voice thundered, "so pile up more turtles. I want about 200. "Turtles, more turtles!" he bellowed and brayed, and the turtles way down in the pond were afraid. They trembled, they shook, but they came, they obeyed. From all over the pond they came swimming by dozens, whole families of turtles with uncles and cousins, and all of them stepped on the head of poor Mac. One after another they climbed up the stack. Then Yertle the Turtle was perched up so high he could see 40 miles from his throne in the sky. "Hooray!" shouted Yertle. "I'm king of the trees. I'm king of the birds, and I'm king of the bees. I'm king of the butterflies, king of the air. Ah me, what a throne! What a wonderful chair! I'm Yertle the Turtle, oh marvelous me, for I am the ruler of all that I see." Then again, from below, in the great heavy stack, came a groan from that plain little turtle named Mac. "Your majesty, please. I don't like to complain, but down here below we are feeling great pain. I know up on top you are seeing great sights, but down at the bottom we too should have rights. We turtles can't stand it. Our shells will all crack. Besides, we need food. We are starving," groaned Mac. "You hush up your mouth," howled the mighty King Yertle. "You've no right to talk to the world's highest turtle. I rule from the clouds, over land, over sea. There's nothing, no nothing, that's higher than me." But while he was shouting, he saw with surprise that the moon of the evening was starting to rise. Up over his head in the darkening skies. "What's that?" snorted Yertle. "Say, what is that thing that dares to be higher than Yertle the King? I shall not allow it. I'll go higher still. I'll build my throne higher. I can, and I will. I'll call some more turtles. I'll stack 'em to heaven. I need about 5,607. But as Yertle the Turtle King lifted his hand and started to order and give the command, that plain little turtle below in the stack, that plain little turtle whose name was just Mac, decided he'd taken enough, and he had. And that plain little lad got a little bit mad. And that plain little Mac did a plain little thing. He burped, and his burp shook the throne of the king. And Yertle the Turtle, the king of the trees, the king of the air and the birds and the bees, the king of a house and a cow and a mule, well, that was the end of the Turtle King's rule. For Yertle, the king of all Salamasand, fell off his high throne and fell plunk in the pond. And today the great Yertle, that marvelous he, is king of the mud. That is all he can see. And the turtles, of course, all the turtles are free, as turtles and maybe all creatures should be.
Now to some inspired words. They came to Capernaum, and when he was in a house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet, because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last, and the servant of all." He took a little child and had him stand among them. Taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever becomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." Luke offers a parallel account of that. An argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child, and he had him stand beside him. And then he said to them, "Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For he who is least among you, he is the greatest." What would Jesus teach? We've looked at a list of things, and today I want to add that Jesus would teach us to be humble. Years ago, I remember hearing a discussion about sin, and it seemed that the majority of the folks in that discussion believed that the root of all sin was our love for self. That when it came down to analyzing every sin, that it had its roots in selfishness. And I think that's probably a fairly valid understanding. Every time I sin, it's because I'm serving myself rather than being obedient. If it is true that the nature of sin is served by selfishness, then is it not also just as aptly true that humility is one of our greatest tools in not serving sin? Being able to humble ourselves then becomes one of the means by which we execute our fight against our trials and our temptations and against the sinfulness that wants us to serve self. I want to just begin by looking extensively at what Jesus taught the disciples. I think it's really interesting that Jesus is going to teach them about humility. The scripture says that the disciples were walking and having a discussion as they walked. The NIV says they were arguing about. We look at other translations, they say that they were discussing. The King James says there was a dispute, or they disputed amongst themselves. The American Standard says they were reasoning. And the Bible in Basic English says they were talking about. So as we look to this word, it's a compound word made up of the preposition, which means to be through, across, or back and forth, and the word logizomai, which has logos in it, which we recognize as meaning word. And it has to do with to take into account, or the process of reckoning, the taking an inventory, processing something. So what the word actually means is that as the disciples were walking, there was a back and forth discussion that was going on over an account of some kind, over an inventory of some nature, and that this discussion was happening between them. Now, in that first verse, we have no idea what the discussion was. In other words, it could have been something very positive, very good. But what the next verse will allow us to understand what the discussion was, what was going on, because the next verse says, they were quiet when Jesus asked them, because on the way they were arguing, they were taking inventory, there was a discussion going back and forth about who was the greatest in the kingdom, who was the Yertle, who deserved to be on top, and who was going to be Mac supporting them. That's what was going on among the disciples. Who was the greatest, the larger, from the root word big? Who's the big shot in the bunch? Who's the one that has the position of authority? Chuck Colson, you'll remember, became legal counsel for Nixon after Watergate started, and actually did prison time and kind of had a spiritual awakening. But he wrote about two other gentlemen in the Nixon administration, Alexander Haig and Ron Ziegler. And both of those individuals were extremely competitive for their position in the Nixon administration. And he tells about an incident that happened after Watergate had started. So things were already going apart for President Nixon. But there was going to be a trip that was going to be made to Russia and to Italy, and Nixon asked Haig and Ziegler to go along. Well, both of them sent teams in preparation for their arrival. And this competition between them was so great that one of the reasons they had sent the teams to prepare was they wanted to find out whose bed was closest to President Nixon's. And so the teams were actually supposed to measure down to the inch who was getting to sleep closer to the president. You want to know who won? The teams didn't think much of this competitive nature. So they made sure each bed was exactly the same measurement, that no one had the advantage in all of that. Boy, this illustrates, though, the nature of pride and arrogance and what the absence of humility becomes like. By the way, Mr. Colson does confess that he too was in that mix, and he utilized his authority to jockey for the closest office to the Oval Office in the White House. So all three of these guys were playing the same game. The disciples are apparently locked into very similar jealousies. Who is going to be first? Who is going to be closest to Jesus? Whose bed will be closest to the Master? And so there's an argument going on. There's a competition that's brewing here. And obviously there is no humility in this discussion. So who would hold that position? The silliness is beyond measure. Jesus was so weary of this that the scripture lets us know that he takes the disciples aside. He calls them aside, and he is going to outline for them the criteria for being the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, if anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all. If anybody wants to be protos, anybody wants to be first, anybody wants to be in front of, anybody wants to be prior, there's a way to accomplish that. Now, it's interesting that Jesus doesn't bemoan our quest for greatness. He doesn't say the desire for greatness is wrong. But what he does do is he says how we meet that desire for greatness. If anyone longs to be first, he must be last. He must be last. From the Greek word echo, which means to hold. So basically what Christ is saying, if you desire to be closest to me, then what you need to do is you need to hold back the desire to be first. You hold it back so much that you actually achieve greatness by being last. Humility. As I think about what this must have looked like, you know, Jesus has the disciples and he asked them what they were talking about, and they're not going to share. Well, we want to know who's the greatest. They're not going to. They're quiet about that, but Jesus knows what the discussion was. And the scripture says he calls them aside. So this is a little one-on-one conversation Jesus is having with the 12. And he lets them know that if you want to be first, you've got to be last. And how do you think the disciples must have looked when Jesus said that? I just see this bewilderment in their face. What? What in the world are you talking about? You're here to overthrow the Roman government, to reestablish the kingdom of God, the Jews. That's why you're here, and you're telling us we're supposed to be content in last place. So it's almost like I envision that Jesus is looking at them, and he's looking at their faces, and he realizes, okay, they don't understand a single thing I just said. And so he's going to provide for them an illustration. He took a little child and had him stand among them. Taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. Look at what's going on here. There's just such tremendous power in the illustration that Jesus used. First of all, it says he places a child in the middle of the disciples. Again, I wasn't there, so I don't know what it looked like, but my imagination has, you know, he's called in the 12, so they've got a huddle going on here. And he's not addressing other crowd people, he's addressing them, so they've kind of closed in the ranks. And I just envision Jesus stepping outside the circle and grabbing a kid, and he brings that child in and he sets him right in the middle. And the disciples are now staring at the child. He's in the middle. As I think about that, he's in the center. He is centered. And apparently there must have been some time for the disciples to get the imagery of being in the middle. Not being in a particular place, but being centered. Then we find that Jesus, it says he takes that child in his arms. Now, I've seen lots of famous portraits of Jesus having a child on his lap. It may have been. He may have just been holding. The word that is used here is the Greek word that would have been used of a toddler through adolescent. I don't think he's picked up a teenager. I suspect this is a young toddler. And if you can just imagine Jesus picking up this child in his arm, small enough child, Jesus has him on his hip. here is an action that to those who have been arguing about who's going to be the greatest in my kingdom, who's going to be on the right and on the left, who's going to have position of relationship with Jesus, what is Jesus visually showing them? You guys are here. I've got a kid with me. This is what it's all about. This is what it's all about. This is the relationship the disciples were arguing about. Next, Jesus instructs them that the method of achieving that relationship with Him is that they need to welcome a child. What does that mean? They need to stoop down, to pick up, to become innocent-like, to become pure-like, to become trusting-like. They need to put themselves on the level of a child. The antithesis of greatness in their minds. Lastly, Jesus shows them that living with that kind of humility not only serves the child, not only does it serve him, but it serves him. So when we practice that kind of humility, he tells the disciples, you just don't serve the child when you welcome them. You welcome me. And if you welcome me, it's not just a position of greatness in my world, it's a position of greatness in the realm of spirituality that God represents when you practice humility. As I thought about what would Jesus teach today, and I thought about the impact that this little moment has on the disciples and the reason Jesus was motivated to teach that, I thought this would definitely be one of the things that Jesus would teach today. How important it is for us to be humble. You know, it's not just Christ that recognizes the need for humility and the practice of humility. I found a number of quotes that I think add to the discussion. C.S. Lewis is the one who first said, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. It's not self-abasement. It's not, oh no, I'm no good, I'm just worth nothing. That's not humility. Humility is just thinking about yourself less. And Jesus would say, obviously, thinking about others more. Nelson Mandela said, lead from the back and let others believe they're in front. Lead from the back and let others believe they're in front. Pride makes us artificial. Humility makes us real. And I love this Chinese proverb. It actually sidetracked me, and I learned some things about bamboo. I'm not going to go into that, but it's pretty impressive. The spiritual lessons that a bamboo tree can teach. Humility. Be like the bamboo. The higher you grow, the deeper you bow. The taller the bamboo shoot, the more flexibility it gets. It's able to withstand the pressures of wind and storm, much greater when it's larger, when it's bigger, when it's reaching greatness, but it enables it to bow lower. Pride is concerned with who is right. Humility is concerned with what is right. Humility is not weakness. It is the epitome of strength. Humility moves a person away from human personal weakness and limitation into divine expression, strength, and expansion. Humility takes us out of weakness and moves us toward God. Yogi Berra, it ain't the heat, it's the humility. The Lakota in their tribal statement, when choosing a leader, we always keep in mind that humility provides clarity where arrogance makes a cloud. The last thing we wanted was to be led by someone whose judgment and actions were clouded by arrogance. Humility creates clarity, arrogance a cloud. Dwight Moody, be humble or you'll stumble. Be humble or you'll stumble. A defeat that leaves you humble is better than a victory that makes you proud. In a humble state, you learn better. The higher we are placed, the more humble we should walk. Augustine said it was pride that changed angels into devils, and it is humility that makes men as angels. Rick Warren, pride builds walls between people, humility builds bridges. Charles Spurgeon, it is not humility to underrate yourself. Humility is to think of yourself as God thinks of you. It is to feel that we have talents God has given them to us, and let it be seen that like freight in a vessel, they tend to sink us low. The more we have, the lower we ought to lie. Humility is we've received gifts from God, and the more we subject ourselves to that mindset, the lower we go in the water. Let's just end by looking at a few. There are so many passages about humility. Proverbs 11, verse 2, pride leads to disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. Matthew 23:12, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Galatians 6 and verse 3, for if a man think himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceiveth himself. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 6, humble yourselves therefore under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Psalm 25 and verse 9, he guides the humble in what is right and teaches them his way. Micah 6 and verse 8, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. 1 Peter 5:5, young men, in the same way be submissive to those who are older. All of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. James chapter 4, humble yourselves therefore, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. Ephesians 4 and verse 2, be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. The humble will see their God at work and be glad. Let all who seek God's help be encouraged. Psalm 69 verse 32. James 4 and verse 6, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Philippians chapter 2, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but rather in humility value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. Galatians 5 and verse 13, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not turn your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. Pride leads to disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. Proverbs 11:2. Of Moses, it is said, now the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Among the lessons that Jesus would teach today, I think he would stand before all who believe in him, and he would say one of the most important and needful elements in your spiritual walk is to be humble. To do away with the Yertle complex, wanting to be on top. Winston Churchill was once asked, Russ, you just told me about Winston Churchill the other night. Yeah, Russ told me some lady came up to Winston Churchill and said, if you were my husband, I would poison your tea. And he looked back and said, if you were my wife, I'd drink it. That was a good one. That was a good one. Okay. Winston Churchill was once asked, doesn't it thrill you to know that every time you make a speech, the hall is packed to overflowing? His response was, yes, it's quite thrilling, flattering. But whenever I feel that way, I always remember that if instead of making a political speech I were being hanged, the crowd would be twice as big. Humility. Humility. Do you want to be the greatest? Jesus didn't discredit that. He just taught us how to do it. You want to be the greatest, you need to do it the way Jesus said to do it. Ready? Set? Go to the back of the line. Humility. Stay humble. Enjoy last place. The prodigal. Good example of someone who learned humility. Went about doing life his way until he realized he found no answers, no solutions there. Only found want and need. So he came to his senses and he said, my father's servants, the day servants, not the household slaves, the day servants are better off than I am. I'll go back. I'll ask if Dad will make me like one of those. Humility. What did humility lead to? Exaltation. Fatted calf, robe, ring, sandals, celebration. Humbling ourselves before God is the means by which he will use to exalt us.